According to the Pareto principle, 80% of the results are produced from 20% of the causes. Today, I'm going to walk you through photography with the 20% to give you the 80% results. Hi, my name is Jay, and I am a wedding photographer, a dad of 3 kids. Let's get into it. So first up, there's a very simple term that we use, which is called the exposure triangle. Now, on one hand, you've got the ISO, which is the sensitivity to light. In the olden days, we are used to having film. When I say the olden days, 50 years ago, we've had film stocks. And here you see this is an ISO 400. What that means is it's rated at ISO 400. When it comes to ISO, the higher the number, the more sensitive to light it is for the recording medium. So in this case, this is the film stock, it's the recording medium, and it's locked in at 400. Now there's ways to get around making it go higher, lower. You're using chemicals back in the old days, but it is possible to change it. Come digital age, you're using a sensor which you can just change on the dial to either go ISO 50 if your camera has it, to all the way up to 256,000 and even higher. So it is really at your fingertips to manipulate that sort of setting for the sensitivity of light. Now, what is some of the effects of ISO? Well, in general, the lower the ISO, the less the noise. And when we talk about noise, we're describing it as very pixelated, very grains that appear on the image. Now, most of the time, if you're taking portraiture, you're taking landscapes, if you're taking still life, you're pretty much not wanting grain within your shots. So therefore, generally speaking, we want to keep ISO to the lowest possible. The next aspect of the exposure triangle is shutter speed. Shutter speed is where we control how fast or how slow the amount of light can be allowed into the capturing medium. So in this case, the camera or the film stock. We primarily use shutter speed to control motion blur. Now, like if you think about it, the longer you leave the shutter, the more likely it's going to capture movement. And the faster the shutter speed, the more likely you're going to freeze the frame of what you're looking at. And usually we correspond to faster shutter speed with more sharper images. Here I'm demonstrating the effects of the shutter by rolling the dial from left to right on the screen, as you see. The first shot is taken at 1/200 of a second, and essentially you can see that there is no motion movement, there's no blurriness to it. If you looked at this straight first time, you would think that there was essentially no movement in the motion. This is also true for the next image. They all look like they're frozen in time. Now the next image I will be taking is I'll slow the shutter down to 1/5 of a second, essentially 0.2 seconds. So that allows a bit more light in, allows a bit more movement into the camera. And as you can see, there's definitely blurriness in the image. And this is how we can demonstrate motion by slowing the shutter speed down. The amazing thing about the shutter speed is there's so much range you can use when it comes to the intervals that you can change at. But we can talk more about this in a later video. Moving on to the last item on the exposure triangle, and that is the aperture. Now the aperture has nothing to do with the camera, but it's more to do with the lens. Now, it's an inverse relationship, meaning that when you look at an aperture, the bigger the size of the aperture, the smaller the number. And there's a mathematical equation for this. So So essentially you just have to remember the smaller the aperture allows less lighting, the bigger the aperture allows more lighting. Now we primarily control this aperture with our cameras, but in the old days you can control the aperture on your lens. The aperture primarily relates to the depth of field. Now I like to think of depth of field as a relationship between your focusing subject and the background. So what that means is if I'm focused on an object and my aperture is set to the widest, which is the smallest number, say f2 for example, its background more than likely would be blurred out. Now if you dial that back, if you dial that down to f22, 32, chances are there's probably no blurriness. It'll look very sharp between your focusing subject and its background. And hopefully I can demonstrate this with a few examples. Another aspect of aperture is bokeh. When there is a defocused area between your focused subject and its background, we call that bokeh. Now the quality of that bokeh changes with the lens you use and also the aperture. So the way the lens is built, how it's constructed with how many blades, how many floating elements, how many elements, is it a prime, is it a zoom, all of this impacts the way bokeh renders. There is endless amount of lenses in the world, and there's also many different qualities of rendering of bokeh. It's a whole new ball game, whole new world out there when you start exploring the different way bokeh is rendered. Okay everybody, here's a quick example of the effects of aperture that produces the depth of field, and what we describe them as narrow. And right now what you're seeing is a narrow field of depth of field, narrow depth of field. The object in the front, which is the Santa doll, is exactly 20 centimeters in front of the lens in the background, and one is in front of another. Currently I have a f2.8 lens, that's the maximum aperture it can go, or that's the widest it can open up. And I will now slowly dial this down, I'll dial up the number, so which makes the aperture get smaller and smaller to show you the effects for field. Now, if I get it all the way up to f22, there is no separation between those two objects. To me, it looks very much like they're next to each other. So we call that a wide depth of field, or a larger depth of field, because there is no separation. And I guess you can almost look at it from a mathematical term, that there's margin of error in terms of the sharpness increases. You've got a lot to play with if you're at f22. But if I dial this back down to 2.8, because it's so narrow, that focus area, you have to get exactly pinpoint right. So hopefully that helps when it comes to creating, or hopefully this visually helps you understand what aperture does. To summarize, exposure triangle consists of the ISO, aperture and shutter. These are the three basic and most fundamental ways of controlling your camera and to build an image from that. So in the future videos, I'll talk more about light, the different modes that you have in your camera, the composition, and hopefully all of that brings together what makes a good image, or an image that is desirable. Lastly, to give you some learnings I've had over the years, I've always saw photography as a game of compromise. Imagine you have the ISO, aperture and shutter as three levers, and you need to pull the different levers and you have to pick which one is the priority. So if I want the image to have a nice blurry background, I will want to shoot with a large aperture. Those are the things you have to think of, and then you dial the other two aspects of the triangle to help you achieve the image that you want. And it's a constant tussle between these three levers that we produce photography. Now, hope that helps, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you for your attention. If you do find this useful, please like and subscribe to my channel. If you want to see certain content or you have certain questions, please comment below. I do read all the comments, and I hope to see you in the future video for more photography.